The earliest civilizations developed in Mesopotamia. Writing, the wheel, mathematics, the first cereal crops, and many other things, including the first written narratives, stories, and law codes were created there. These people were finding out exactly what it takes to build and maintain a complex society. They had to learn how to keep the peace, maintain stability, and minimize violence within the walls of their cities. Failing to do this would weaken their society and expose them to threats from the outside from other city-states. A weak state is often the result of ineffective governance. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a 4,000-year-old story from ancient Mesopotamia, and it might be the oldest written story we have. In the story, Gilgamesh is the king of Uruk. He's the greatest king ever, and he decides to go on an adventure to kill a monster. He's going to be away for a while, so he brings together the elders of the city to instruct them how to manage the place while he's gone, so that he still has a kingdom to return to when he's done. He says to the elders, "Let not the youths gather in the street to form an assemblage, for much discord and unrest they will cause. Judge fairly the grievances and petitions of the weak and the poor, and let not the strong and wealthy gain unjust advantage." He gives them these 3 pieces of advice, does not elaborate further, drops the mic and walks out, loaded up with all kinds of armour and weapons. Gilgamesh had been a real king, but he had died generations earlier, and all these fantastic stories about him developed over time, so this is not going to be a real quote from the man himself, of course. These words are probably what the author believes the greatest king of all time would say. There are other parts of the story that drag on and become tedious to me as a modern reader, but this part is straight to the point, uses very few words, so let's expand on each of these 3 points. Let not the youths gather in the street to form an assemblage, for much discord and unrest they will cause. Ancient Mesopotamia was a very patriarchal society at the time, so I dare say that he was talking about young men in particular, loitering in the streets, forming into groups, into gangs. This might sound a bit tyrannical and authoritarian to not let youths gather in the streets, but if you've ever looked at the numbers around crime, violence, public order, you'll find that statistically, younger people are more likely to commit crime, more likely to be victims of crime, and this has remained consistent since records began. I was putting together some basic stats to show the relationship between age, gender and crime, and I found this research by Pinkerton, who was an American private security contractor. Their video summary is fairly consistent with everything else I've looked at.
The age crime curve has been a striking feature of criminology since the 1800s. Across different societies and eras, it tells a similar story about crime, finding a sharp spike in offender rates during the teenage years, peaking in the late teens, and typically dropping off in the early 20s. The age crime curve varies depending on offenses. Property crimes peak among earlier age groups, whereas violent crimes tend to peak later in life. These data points shed further light on the susceptibility of young people and the meaningful impact that programs explicitly targeting teenage youth can have on both individual outcomes and society at large.
It appears that this was also true 4,500 years ago, and it gets worse the more disenfranchised and disadvantaged they are. Young men who don't have purpose will find purpose in the streets. If they don't have role models, they will find role models in the streets. When you feel that you don't have much value to society and you're invisible and powerless, you can at least feel like you have some power and control for a short time by victimizing someone else. When you're hanging out with other similar people, being violent can help you gain respect among them, among your peers, who are other lost and directionless young men. Even if you do everything possible to give them purpose, guidance, education, opportunities from the start, some are still going to slip through the cracks and become offenders. And when they do that, especially if they are violent offenders, they have to be stopped. If this behaviour is permitted, or we are more lenient toward young men in particular, in my opinion, the behaviour only escalates. When there is excessive crime in the streets and authorities are not doing much about it, the population in general loses their faith in their leadership and they start taking justice into their own hands. I think it's accurate to describe that as discord and unrest. Street level crime cannot be ignored. You have to do something about it. You only have to take your attention away as a government for a moment for the problem of crime to become destabilising. If you think I'm going too far stretching this analysis a bit based on a single sentence, let's just think about it at face value. Imagine you're walking down the street at night alone, any street in the world, and you come across a group of young men just loitering there. Would that not make you feel uncomfortable at a minimum? You can't ignore that gut feeling. You know what's going on. So what does that tell you? Judge fairly the grievances and petitions of the weak and the poor. When you have a lot of people living in a city in close proximity, you need an impartial third party to settle disputes. Without an impartial legal system, those with more power are able to influence the decisions made in the system. Everyone should get a fair trial, no matter who they are, where they're from, what their history is. There's a record of a young woman named Amat Shamash who was promised the home of her parents when they died. And when they did die somehow, their brothers tried to claim it from her, that they were the rightful heirs. Again, this was a very patriarchal society. Women had a limited role and far less power than men. But she was able to produce a document signed by witnesses and bring them all to court to give their testimony, and she proved that she was the rightful owner despite being in a weaker position socially. This is an essential part of building a robust society. And if you can't trust the legal system to make impartial judgments, this creates severe systemic issues in society. People lose faith in their institutions. When they can't get justice from the justice system, they will find their own and they will default to violence. And then you get reprisal attacks, you get people taking sides, and it can lead to a larger conflict. Even some fairly minor grievances can lead to some extreme outcomes. You might have heard of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth from the Bible. The earliest reference we know comes from the Code of Hammurabi in Mesopotamia, which is about 1700 years older than the Bible. And the legal concept is probably a lot older, but Hammurabi's law code is the oldest version we've found so far. You might have also heard the counterpoint, which is an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind, because it's quite extreme compared to modern law codes, and some might even say barbaric. The thing is, back then, this concept was far more civilized than what people do by default, which is to use violence or to kill each other. In a civilized society, when people can't resolve their disputes, they can outsource this and take it to an impartial third party to make a decision and follow through with punishment. The third point is not to let the strong and wealthy gain unjust advantage. When certain groups are allowed to take advantage of others, you get these two parts within society who see each other as the enemy. Again, it erodes trust in institutions, in leadership, in government. This is not to say that there was no inequality back then. We're talking about a time and place where slavery was the norm. But they obviously noticed that when the wealthy exploit the poor, at a certain point you end up with blood in the streets. So Gilgamesh, the idealized perfect king, should put something in place to make sure that doesn't happen. A closely related issue to inequality and exploitation is corruption. When there is extensive corruption, embezzlement, the misappropriation of public funds where the wealth of a state is being used for the benefit of the leadership and not the public, this leads to revolt and unrest. These are the comorbidities of a dying state. The only way to avoid this death is to fix the problems or resort to oppression to avoid revolution. So we've known this stuff since civilization started. To maintain stability in society, you need to uphold your end of the bargain as the leadership, as the elders or the government, and to make sure your society is safe, that you settle disputes fairly and address inequality. These three things are definitely not all you need to run a society, but they are very important. It amazes me that these were the three things that the king in the story chose to address, and they're still so relevant today.